Welcome, everyone. My name is Brooke Hummel from Jensen Hughes. Thank you all so much for joining us today for the roundtable discussion on the COVID-19 social distancing plans and solutions for transportation. We appreciate your attendance. We hope everyone's staying safe and healthy. Allow me to introduce you to our presenters today. So speaking with us today, we have Mike Ferreira, who is Vice President of Transportation at Jensen Hughes. We have Vince Grattan, who is Partner and Transit Practice Lead at Entro. And we have Amir Rahmani, who is the Pedestrian Modeling Expert at Jensen Hughes. I'm going to turn this over to Mike Ferreira, and we can get started.
All right, thanks, Brooke, and thanks everyone on the line for attending. I see that we have a mix of transportation agencies, airport operators, design architects, and engineers who signed up for this call, so it should be a good discussion. And as Brooke stated, we are going to be taping the webinar, so we'll provide a link for anybody that may have dialed in late or who wants to share the content with their colleagues. For those of you who maybe aren't familiar with Jensen Hughes or Entro and what we do, I'll give you a very brief introduction. Jensen Hughes is an international consulting firm specializing in fire protection, security, and safety. We specialize in a range of analytical methods from risk and threat assessment to fire, blast, and security vulnerability analysis. We conduct a range of modeling from CFD to pedestrian movement and have worked on a number of the largest, most notable airport and rail transportation facilities worldwide. Entro is an international placemaking and experience design firm. Their work gives voice to the built environment and shapes how people experience space, how they think, feel, and behave in a space. They're well known for their work in wayfinding and signage and have an impressive portfolio of work in the transit and airport sectors. We saw a number of common strategies between how they approach design and how we can understand and validate behavior through the modeling work that we do, which was really the genesis for forming this webinar. So I'll go over the agenda really briefly. We're going to start off by talking about some of the impacts of COVID-19 on the air and rail transportation industry. We will go over our approach to looking at this problem, which we call plan, quantify, and reinforce. By plan, we refer to space planning and incorporating social distancing into your design and configuration of your facility. Quantifying through the use of pedestrian modeling to verify that plan, and then reconfiguring that plan if the modeling shows outcomes that may not have been foreseen. Reinforcement is through use of effective signage, and that's where our partner Entro comes in, and they'll be presenting that portion of the presentation. And we'll end with a summary followed by our Q&A, and hopefully we'll leave ample time for that. So obviously the reason why we're here is due to COVID-19, and perhaps what we don't know exceeds what we do know at this point. And I am not going to even try to be an expert on this issue. But what I can say is that the symptoms are fairly well known. What happens when somebody gets COVID and the degree to which people come down with symptoms varies. Transmission is, in the modes of transmission are somewhat less known, and they're argued a little bit more. And prevention, again, is more of a known quantity. We know that if you use some of the personal hygiene methods, wear a mask, and avoid large crowds and social distance, it's usually pretty effective. As of, I think, yesterday, I pulled this data. We're almost at 15 million cases worldwide, and there pretty much isn't a country in the world that isn't affected by this issue. Obviously, some more than others, and we're experiencing a lot of impacts in the United States. Our presentation today, we're going to be really talking about the two issues. Well, really, the main issue is social distancing, but social distancing and masking are probably the two #1 things that can be done by a transportation facility to limit the impacts of COVID. And we're really going to be focusing on the social distancing aspects today. probably not news to those of you who are on the phone, but the impacts on the airline industry have been substantial. Traffic at one point early on in March and April dropped off by almost 95% worldwide. And the degree to which that's come back has varied depending on who has a handle on the virus, but still it's way down from where it was just a couple of months ago. Likewise, for the passenger rail industry, again, volumes are way down. We're seeing 75% reductions across the US, complete shutdowns in India, and less of an impact in some areas in Asia, but still a substantial impact, more than we would like to see. Now, obviously, COVID has been around for a few months now, so there have been measures taken in transportation facilities to address social distancing. But I think what we're seeing is that social distancing isn't really being addressed currently in a holistic manner. It's really being done ad hoc and in a reactive way. In some cases, there is a little bit more thought going into it, but the worst case is people slapping tape lines on the floor and just kind of trying to reinforce social distancing that way. Obviously, anything to be done is good, but we are taking more of a holistic approach to this issue. So our approach really has three phases in our response to the social distancing mandate. Phase one is to plan. Before you really know what you want to do with to deal with social distancing, you need to forecast your passenger numbers. Right now, passenger numbers are significantly declined, so it's a little bit easier to achieve social distancing. You have more space. But as those numbers come up, it's going to impact, and potentially you may have to revisit your social distancing configuration as passenger numbers increase. There are obviously the desired behaviors that you want to reinforce: masking, procedures, social distancing in various areas of your facilities. Understanding your space limitations. Some places may be difficult to really achieve social distancing just because your space limited. And developing these strategies before moving forward with an outcome. What we're bringing to the table, we believe, is the quantification of those methods. And we strongly believe that performing pedestrian modeling is important because a lot of times you identify outcomes that were not intended, you identify congestion points, unintended consequences, and before implementing a strategy, you can modify that strategy accordingly. It allows you to modify that space plan and reevaluate. You can reevaluate once passenger numbers start to increase, so you can constantly be looking at the strategy and seeing if it's effective. You can address accessibility concerns due to mobility impaired persons, as well as behavioral and cultural responses. In some areas of the world, people behave differently, whether it be responding to signage, personal space constraints, things like that, and we can look at all of these issues with modeling. Finally, once you've come up with a strategy, you model it to know that it's going to be effective, you want to reinforce that strategy, and the best way to do that is through effective communication. You can do that in a number of different ways: audio, graphics, signage, the design of the space itself, which we call placemaking. And the intent of doing all of this is to modify passenger behaviors in the way that you want them to behave. And we'll be focusing primarily on the use of signage in this presentation. Again, we're going to move on to planning, the first phase of our approach. And on the planning, you really want to, it's a function of forecasting the passenger numbers, looking at the constraints of your space, but also taking a really holistic view of what you're trying to achieve and what the outcomes need to be. So this is a diagram of a typical airport space, and we'll walk you through it. And social distancing needs to occur in several areas. When a typical passenger enters the facility, they typically go to the ticketing counters. There may be queues while they're waiting to get in line, whether that be where they're interacting with a person at a ticketing desk or with automated machines. There's some sort of queuing that takes place. Then they move through some sort of security line, and many airports are already space constrained just to get the normal flow through security under normal conditions, never mind if you're trying to implement social distancing. There's the screening process, and the normal baggage screening may need to be reconfigured to allow for some more social distancing and the rate at which people go through the screening. And there's also, at some point, there may be temperature screening that takes place. So an additional waypoint that the passengers have to go through that's not normally there in the normal course of travel. Passengers then proceed to the waiting areas, and again, the waiting areas are normally seats that have people right next to one another. So you may need to block off every other seat to achieve the social distancing, which reduces the amount of available space for passengers to take up. And that needs to be well planned out during the waiting process. And finally, boarding. Depending on the airline, they may call people up in groups and people will just join a line. So there needs to be some sort of marking of the boarding line and boarding area to achieve social distancing. There are also other airlines that have people line up next to signage. Southwest Airlines in the United States is one example of that, and that's just a different configuration that needs to be considered. Similarly for rail, once somebody enters the facility, they may either go to ticketing kiosks or ticketing machines. Then they have to go through the gates with their ticket, and there may be some backup there depending on the time of day. They go through the vertical circulation elements, escalators and stairs, down to the platform. The platform is often a challenging area because as people start to wait for the trains and you potentially could miss a headway or something like that, there can be a buildup of people on the platform, and that's somewhat space constrained. As people board the trains, there's an issue of waiting. I think we're all kind of hardwired to, when the train comes, getting on as quickly as possible because the doors open and close so quickly. So perhaps there's something there that can be done with the timing and also signage and notification to let people know they have more time to board the train. And then the opposed flow when people are exiting the train when they're trying to board, so the alighting from the train. And all of these need to be considered in your holistic space planning process. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Amir, who's going to talk about the quantification through modeling.
Thank you, Mark. Further to our response to the social distancing mandate and from a quantifying perspective, our main goals here are to inform decision-making process by quantifying any mitigation strategies with the help of flow modeling. So we have used various softwares for crowd flow simulation based on their application, both on their normal operation and emergencies. And for today's webinar, we have used Mass Motion due to its recent social distancing features, which will facilitate the evaluation of any strategies with the intent of addressing COVID-19 concerns in transit hubs. So on the clip on the left, basically shows a multi-mode transit station with the passengers walking between bus station and train station without any social distancing in practice. So as you can see, people are walking as a group or individually, and they are mainly in close proximity to one another and moving in a group or individually with no social distancing. However, the clip on the right, as you can see, is a simulation where passengers are trying to maintain 2-meter social distancing from one another. And there are some areas that passengers are violating that physical distancing, especially when they are moving in opposite direction. This will illustrate the point that passengers tend to use their usual route and maintain the physical distancing where and when possible, like what happens in real life. We are using 3 metrics in order to quantify the impact of social distancing measures. The first one is time in proximity metrics, which basically displays the total duration that passengers are spending in close proximity to one another in a given area. The next metric is maximum proximity, which displays the max number of passengers that have been close together in a given area. And the third one is total passenger count, which shows the total population count over the analysis period. In our example 1, a typical airport, as Mike mentioned, we have used a typical airport and we were focused on just the check-in area for testing some conventional and proposed queue configurations. So the clip on the left shows the check-in area with no social distancing in practice, so business as usual, and we are using some conventional queuing formats. As you can see, people are spending a lot of time in close proximity to one another, and the number of passengers that are close together are pretty high on the left clip. However, when we go to the right clip, it shows the modified queue configuration where people are maintaining their 2-meter social distancing from one another. Therefore, both time and the number of people who are within close proximity to one another is lower than the no social distancing model, which will be illustrated in the heat maps in next slides. When we're looking at time in proximity metrics, so in conventional queuing configuration, people are spending more than 5 minutes within 2 meters of each other, and also the number of people is pretty high as well. That's why you're seeing basically every spot on the conventional snake-shaped queue is red spot. And if you look at the next heat map, which we are focusing on the modified queue configuration, you see we have a significant improvement in terms of the time that people are spending within close proximity to one another. However, there are some small red spots or hot spot on those turns, which Vince will discuss them in details in a moment. The next metric is the max proximity, which again represents the max number of people who are within 2 meters of each other, and a conventional one. As you can see, for all the spots in that queue shape, in the snake-shaped queue, we have more than 6 people who are within 2 meters of each other. And if you look at the modified queue, we again have a significant improvement in terms of the max number of people who are within close proximity, within 2 meters of each other. And we barely have 2 people while they are moving on the queues. And again, on those turning points, we have like 2 to 3 people in terms of the number, which is a huge improvement. And the last one is the population graph, which you can see. The implementation of those queue configuration will give us a huge benefit in terms of the total number of people who are within a specified proximity to one another.
So thanks, Amir. So this is Vince from Intro, and I'll be talking a little bit about the reinforcement aspect that Mike mentioned earlier in the slides, but mainly through graphic and signage interventions that can essentially help support physical distancing and the desired behaviors that we're looking to achieve. So as we saw in this airport queuing example, just by altering the queue configurations, we can actually help increase that social distancing and improve the distancing between each passenger. So simulation models are absolutely fabulous tools, but there's always going to be outliers in real life, so where you can't predict maybe the behaviors of individual people. So the way we think is, how can graphics really help support and reinforce those desired flows and the behaviors that are being described in the flow model? Go to the next page. Yeah, so here are the 2 queue configurations. So you can see that the one on the left, it's basically just a snaked queue, and you'll notice that each individual laneway is actually physically separated by that 2-meter distance, or approximately 2 meters, and it's quite successful. On the right-hand side, you have more of a standard queue configuration, but with increased lane widths to achieve that 2-meter distance. But what we find, especially on the right-hand side, is that at all of the switchbacks in the lanes, that people have a harder time keeping that distance. And I think Amir had mentioned that it's time and proximity that's a bit of an issue at those switchbacks. So keeping in mind that what we're going to be showing today as examples are purely strategy. We're not necessarily recommending to do the graphics that you see on screen, and we're going to get into that a little bit later in the presentation. But if you go to the next slide, you'll see that a solution like this, a queuing solution, could be as simple as just having three products, 3 sign types that you could implement into that space. So the first one on the left could be just a freestanding sign element that you could put at the beginning of a queue. It just helps people understand basically what all the different signage products are for. And it's all placeholder messages right now. Obviously, it would depend on the space and on the architectural configurations as well. The product in the middle could be something as simple as a floor graphic. do not stand with hatching marks displaying where people can cross or cannot cross. And then on the right-hand side, you have the yellow dot, and we've seen this pretty much everywhere. Oftentimes people put X's and so on, just indicating where people can stand in order to achieve that social distancing. But again, this is only a strategy. You'll notice that it's very literal and it's very utilitarian. So if we look at it in a space like we're looking at right now, you can see that you can achieve it at a fairly low cost. There's not that many elements to this strategy. And it works. I mean, people will stay behind those hatch lines and so on. But is this really the ideal solution? Does it fit within the space that it's intended for? Does it add an element of stress? Oftentimes people don't want to be told where to go, how to do it, to do this or not to do that. So what we'll do is a bit later in the presentation, we're going to look at how all of these concerns can be addressed and how the strategy can be applied in a more thoughtful manner that addresses all those items. But first, I think the next step is Amir will take us through a similar exercise, but for a transit platform. And we'll come back to some of the graphics.
Thank you, Vince. So in the second example for this webinar, we are looking at a center platform subway station with bidirectional stairs and escalators at each end of the platform. So the clip on the left, basically business as usual with no social distancing in practice and two-way stairs and escalators going up. And just please note the 3D geometries has been hidden for visualization purposes. And if you look at the clip on the right, you see that people are trying to maintain social distancing, and also we have changed the direction of the VCEs, and both stairs and escalators are just unidirectional now, just moving downward from concourse towards the platform. Again, when we look at the time in proximity metrics, the model, you see people are spending more than 5 minutes without even tending to use those areas in the middle of the platform, and they're just queuing up in front of the train doors on the southern edge of the platform. And when we look at the modified model, when we change the direction of VC and people are practicing this 2-meter social distancing, you see people are still spending more than 5 minutes, but they have started to use those middle areas on the platform, which is a good sign that people are tend to spend less time in close proximity to one another and use the entire space of the platform. And here it's the max proximity, and you see we have basically during the 15 minutes analysis period, we have more than 6 people waiting in front of the train doors. But when we look at the modified model, that's here when we get the max benefit from these measures. As you see, we barely have 6 people in front of the door, so people are using the entire space of the platform while maintaining the 2-meter social distancing, which is a great benefit. So we don't have that many people close together. And like the airport example, this graph, the bar charts basically are illustrating a significant drop in number of people who are in close proximity to one another. And with that, I turn it over to Vince.
Great, thanks, Amir. So as we saw in this example, in this platform model, this is the most successful, I guess, model that was put through. But there's certain areas where we can obviously see that it's more difficult to keep that social distancing. So namely at the entrances and the exits from the actual train doors, you'll see that there's a few areas there. And also at the entry and exit points from vertical circulation, so the stairs, the escalators, and the elevators. So looking at this space, we could start thinking of what kind of strategy or graphic signage strategy could we use to reinforce the behaviors, to even improve this model a little bit more and that allow more social distancing. If you go to the next slide. Again, this is a strategy, so I'll just describe really quickly. Keep in mind that this is just a plan view of one section of the platform, so obviously this would extend quite a bit further on either end. But here what we can see is that as a graphic solution, as a graphic strategy, I should say, You can see that there's the black portion that goes around the platform. And that really is for detraining passengers. So people that are coming off the train naturally can walk down those black areas, and that leads them to the vertical circulation elements. You'll also notice that even text can be used, and we see this a lot in place right now in certain areas. But there's certain strategies that can be used. Here you'll see that the text is oriented towards the person that's intended to be the reader. So as people come out of the train, the text is oriented towards them, so they know that that message is intended for them. So for people who are in training or getting on the train, they obviously come down the escalators, the stairs, or the elevators, and then they can make their way to that middle section of the platform. The yellow dots indicate that minimum 2-meter distance. And there's also other elements. You'll notice that there's quite a bit of text on here. If you go to the next slide, it's just a summary of the products that could be used for a platform. Because of the high volumes, there's a few more products here, but they don't necessarily all need to be used. But you'll see on the left-hand side, we have a freestanding sign that could be placed near the stairs or near that vertical circulation. That just explains what the graphics are for. Again, you'll see in the middle, we have the two floor graphics that essentially have that yellow and black hatching, just to indicate where people can cross or cannot cross. We also have the dot on the right-hand side, again, the same purpose as we saw in the airport example. And then most platforms have a variable message sign, an electronic sign that you can see at the top. So those are good opportunities to be able to add some additional messaging, either through the actual digital sign or as an add-on, like you see here on top. And you'll see that we're using a lot of pictograms and things like that. But again, I just want to emphasize that this is essentially a strategy. So if we go to the next slide, if we apply that strategy onto an actual kind of rendered station, we can see that it starts to become a little bit more clear that there is a defined pathway for exiting and entering. And you'll notice on the right and on the left, there's also that light yellow strip, which is typically a tactile strip, as most people probably know. It's a bit of a no-go zone, so unfortunately it does reduce the amount of space, but obviously safety is number one concern, so we are not using those spaces. And again, what we're showing here is just a strategy, and it's very literal and utilitarian. And there's a way to do this in a less intrusive manner that reflects the stations. So how can we successfully apply these strategies? Which brings me back to the reinforcement aspect that Mike had mentioned. So when we're applying a strategy to platforms, we really want to communicate effectively and with as few kind of words and verbiage as possible in order to modify people's behaviors. But by simply slapping on utilitarian graphics and signs that may cause some type of risk. So there are other aspects to consider as part of this. So we'll look here at some of the risks that are associated with placing graphics and just wayfinding in general. So utilitarian graphics like we've been seeing, and how we've mostly the type that we see out in the world right now really can increase stress levels for people. Like I said earlier, telling people what to do, where to stand, where not to stand, can actually increase that stress level. And it can also take away from the sense of place. So people are detracted by these things, and they might not appreciate the actual space that they're in because they're focusing so much on what they're allowed and not allowed to do. Another risk is obviously a financial investment. We all know that it costs something to apply these graphics, but it can be done, and there are certain strategies that can be done at a lower cost solution. So it's definitely something that we can talk a little bit about later. And obviously there's some uncertainty associated with all these graphics. It's great to have modeling, but like I said earlier, some people just don't follow rules at all, so there is some uncertainty. And also, we mentioned earlier some cultural differences. So people behave quite differently depending on which culture. So the example we're looking at here is really more of a kind of a North American example. But if you can think of, for example, in Japan, people's behavioral responses to graphics and environments can vary quite significantly from culture to culture. So it's something that should be definitely considered as you develop strategies. And that brings us to some of the goals that really we're trying to achieve here. So the overall goals is really trying to improve the overall experience, but still while keeping that safe distance. So the safety and that perception of safety. And we want to make the whole experience more intuitive for people so that they don't really necessarily have to rely on signage and wayfinding. And you do that by reducing the uncertainty and reducing the stress as well. And obviously, we're also looking for operational improvements, whether that be increasing the efficiencies of space planning or just improving overall the passenger flows of the stations and so on. So looking at this example here is a modified example. It's essentially the same example we just looked at for the platform, but it's been modified slightly. So you'll notice that it's much less harsh. And it's like I said, it's simplified, and you'll notice that a lot of the verbiage has been removed. A lot of the do nots and stand here and so on have been removed. So you can apply this strategy in a way that's more complementary to the environment, and that can actually enhance the user experience. So all the products are the same. It's just a matter of how you treat the design of the products and the application of them in the 3D space. So on the next slide, we have the same plan view that we looked at earlier, but using this new kind of simplified strategy. So as we can see here, we've eliminated the language. We're still using some of the techniques where the text is facing certain directions to capture certain people. You'll notice we've gotten rid of the black and yellow hatch marks, replaced them with something a little bit more subtle. We've decluttered some of that black and white signage as well that's lying around. And so just by using thoughtful graphics and patterns, you can really start to modify people's behaviors and make the flows more intuitive so that users may not even be aware that their behavior is being modified in the space that they're occupying. So if we look at this in a rendered example, so in the next slide, so this is the same station as we saw previously. But what you can see automatically is that it's much less intrusive. The black lines are much, much less intrusive for people. And you can actually start to complement that whole space place brand that either transit agencies or airports are trying to convey. They do spend a lot of money on these things. So to put down all these utilitarian graphics sometimes can negate that whole aspect of placemaking. So here you can also see the red marks on the floor. And people intuitively tend to stand on kind of outstanding markings on the floor. So you'll see that you don't even necessarily have to indicate that you have to stand here or do not stand here, because people's intuition will kind of do the trick for them. And that really does help reduce the stress of passengers, and it leads to a better user experience and ultimately also improves the flows of stations, and you can maintain those safe distances. And I also really find it interesting how people do, in fact, kind of will naturally social distance just by using graphics. So this can be just as effective, or if not more effective, than the utilitarian literal examples that we typically see out in the world, or the ones that we saw earlier, which were just the strategies. So when we look at everything that we've talked about today in summary, like COVID has created so many challenges, especially for airports and transits, which have quite a high volume of people. But by using that same 3-point strategy that Mike had mentioned, the plan, quantify, and reinforce, you can come up with some effective and some meaningful solutions that are done in a thoughtful way and that are successful. So I would like to stress, though, that there is no one solution for every airport or every transit station. What we looked at today are just two really simplified examples, almost looking at it in a bubble. And this strategy should really be tied into a larger strategy, a larger holistic strategy. As Mike mentioned earlier as well, like making changes can have upstream or downstream changes or impacts, especially when we're looking even at signage and wayfinding. You can imagine in an airport, if you change a message upstream, you might have to change all the messages from that point of entry. So it's something to definitely consider as a holistic solution rather than looking at things in a bubble, like only the queuing or only the baggage check or things like that. So to truly understand the impacts that potential social distancing solutions will have, we really feel that pedestrian flow modeling is extremely useful in developing the strategies. and they can actually inform what kind of interventions are needed that are required, and they can actually vet those solutions prior to the actual implementation of the solutions. Otherwise, like we said, it might have unintended effects. So overall, we feel that you can really enhance the user experience and also improve operationally how people move through the space by using some of these techniques and the model that we've looked at today.
All right. Thanks, everyone. We're going to open it up for questions now. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, for those of you who might have joined late, we'll be taping and are taping this webinar, and we'll provide a link to everyone that signed up after the fact. But we'll like to open it up for any questions that you might have.
Hey, Mike, if I can jump in, one question did come through. I'm hoping you guys can address that quickly while some other folks think of theirs and send those through. Can you talk a little bit about what is a good or bad maximum proximity?
So there are a couple of things with the metrics. When you're looking at the modeling, a lot of it is for comparison purposes. You know that you're getting a marked improvement by taking on the strategy, and instead of having 6 people around you, you have 2 people around you. The general rule of thumb that we've seen is the 2-meter separation distance between people. So the distance is somewhat well-defined in the recommendations from the various health agencies around the world. But the other 2 metrics we're using, which is the time in proximity. You know that if somebody comes within your 2-meter circle for 1 second, it's not the same as if they're within that 2-meter circle for several minutes and breathing in your general direction. I mean, it's a very different thing and difficult to quantify. The same thing when you're doing the social distancing, you're trying to limit it so no one is within that distance, but keeping it so that maybe 1 or 2 people enter that circle during the normal course of travel, but not 5 and 6 when you're in some sort of crowd. Is beneficial. So there aren't any hard and fast metrics for the time in proximity or for the number of people in proximity. And we typically do this on even a normal building evacuation. There's no set time to evacuate a building in the building codes in most places around the world, but you're looking at, does that improvement improve the situation? And if you're going from 6 people around you for quite a long period of time to at most 2 people around you, that's definitely a valued improvement and at least can be quantified. Right now, the social distancing measures that are being put in place, they seem to follow some sort of rule of thumb, or let's put this line on the floor here, but it isn't being quantified.
I know we touched upon it in the presentation. The one thing I keep wanting to emphasize, this is Vince from Entro, is that trickle effect. Like today, we just looked at the queuing at an airport and at the platform. But from a larger perspective, you can think of it like, for example, in an airport, where do people tend to congregate? At flight information displays, baggage information displays, when they're picking up their luggage, when they're queuing at the check-in lines, and so on. So when we say that this could have a trickle effect, really mean it that you have to look from the moment someone enters into the space to the moment they either get on the plane or get off the plane, etc. So looking at it holistically, I think, is really the key. But given the time that we have today, we had to focus on one small element. But that strategy that we've outlined really is something that could be applied holistically for the entire space.
And I want to make a note that for any of you on the line, if you want to share your experience, maybe at your airport or rail transportation facility, or if there's any questions you may have specific to your facility, feel free to ask that as well.
Hi, this is Kiva Rodriguez from BWI Marshall Airport. And just to kind of add to the conversation a little, some of the measures that we've taken is recently placing floor decal in primarily the queuing areas for the ticket counters. We have also completed an upgrade of a social distancing software. Well, it's actually a software, analytic software, and it has a social distancing capability from a company called iInside. And so it's primarily used as a checkpoint management tool. So we can see where social distancing is not being performed, and we're currently in the process of adding monitors or information on the display boards to allow people to correct, self-correct, to make sure that they are keeping that distance. So it may show up as kind of like a dot, a red dot, if someone is too close to someone else, and they can kind of correct in that area. So that's some of the immediate strategies that we are taking advantage of, and that we are hoping to expand on. And actually, I really found the usage of the markings on the platform very interesting. It makes it kind of, spurred some inspiration to see what we could do around those baggage claim areas. I don't think we've had any discussion on what we're doing to make sure that there's proper distance between passengers and users in that area. So I thank you for that.
Kiva, thank you for sharing your experience. Do you mind if I ask you if, have you had a chance to look and measure somehow through looking at your security video or direct observation, whether or not people are following the predicted behaviors, and that whether or not the signage is working based on, how people are actually behaving?
Right. So I have not. That wowould be under our airport technology and operations group. So it's something I definitely want to follow up on. I mean, I think that's, a very important question. Now, I do know that, with the low numbers of travelers that we've had in the previous months, that based on the users and the travelers and passengers we've had in our facility, we have not had any significant occurrences of confusion or breaches of social distancing. So I think it's worth to at least follow up to see how that analytical tool is working for us now that the numbers are increasing slowly, but they're increasing.
Yeah, that's all. Sorry, I was just going to say that's always of very interest to me. Doing a lot of modeling is whether or not the modeling actually proves out in reality. So thanks for that.
Kiva, thanks again. That's really interesting to hear that you guys have gone to such extents to make sure that we're in place. Have you had feedback from passengers and guests about their experience in the airport or about what you've done?
From my understanding, our passengers and our guests have been very comfortable with the measures that we put in place. Our cleaning has taken top priority, as you can imagine, in our facility. So, we've done we have actually launched an entire marketing campaign on, of course, social distancing, some of the tools we're using, as well as our cleaning techniques. So we have a series of marketing campaigns to inform our passengers of what to expect before entering into the facility, and also what we're doing while they're inside of our facility.
Great.
It's also an interesting point because you're absolutely right. We haven't seen those numbers come back up yet. So a lot of these strategies haven't really been implemented in the environment that they're intended to work in. So it's really a big test, I guess, that we're going to see in the upcoming months to see what kind of strategies are deployed around various airports and transit stations. So it is quite curious to see how that's all going to work out. But in the presentation, we said quite a few Mike had mentioned ad hoc solutions. And I think those solutions were required. When this all broke out, I guess it was now February, March, people didn't have the time to kind of consider all these factors. So they were kind of forced to put in these quick solutions, and which in essence, they do work to some degree. But now that we're getting further in, we're starting to see the impacts that social distancing has on transportation services. So to start looking at it in a little bit more depth, and to see how the overall operations of airports and transit stations are going to be affected by this, I think it's really critical at this time. And it's going to be I guess a grand experiment that we'll see how this works out.
You can always feel free to contact us directly for any questions you might have or feedback, or even just to provide us feedback. We're always interested to hear what people are doing later after the fact, once you receive the follow-up with the link to this webinar.
Okay, well, thank you all so much for joining us. I am going to finish recording, and I'm going to close out this meeting. And as Mike said, if anyone has any questions that they either couldn't share on this call or after reviewing the recording, please reach out to us. We're happy to help in any way that we can. And we hope you all continue to stay safe and healthy, and take care.